Does coffee make you anxious, sweaty, unfocused, or maybe your doctor thinks you have a crippling caffeine addiction, which I am definitely not in any way referencing for my personal life? Let me turn you on to Mantra Matcha. Mantra Matcha is ceremonial-grade matcha from a private hillside in Uji, Japan. Smooth, naturally sweet, and it gives you this calm, focused energy without the jitters. It's packed with antioxidants like more than 130 times more than regular green tea, so you feel energized and you feel good. Now, the matcha flavor isn't for everybody, but good news, Matcha has 6 infused flavors like banana cacao, strawberry lemon, cinnamon goji berry, and rosehip dragon fruit, which sounds like a name from Game of Thrones, but it's delicious. Plus, every box you buy helps provide a meal to a child through the No Kid Hungry program, which we love. Now, right now, listeners to Make It Make Sense can go to mantramatcha.com and use the code MIMS25 for 15% off. Now, that code also supports Make It Make Sense with a commission. That's how these things work. I got to legally tell you. But the good news is you'll help the show, you'll stay caffeinated, and maybe not too much. Again, that code at mantramatcha.com is MIMS25 for 15% off. Mantra Matcha, less chaos, more clarity, 2 things we could all use a little bit of right now. All right, let's get on with the show. It's Thursday, February 12th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Harms. Today on the show, the push to change the way you vote before you head to the polls this year. We're going to be talking about 2 different bills, the SAVE Act, or the Save America Act, they're the same thing, and the MEGA Act. Both would require strict proof of citizenship when you go to register to vote, and then again at the polls, as well as completely get rid of the ways that tens of millions of Americans cast their ballots to upend the way states run their elections. All of that is a solution in search of a problem, or more accurately, a solution to the entirely made-up problem of widespread voter fraud. Now, before we get to that, make sure you're following or subscribe to the podcast wherever you watch or listen. Leave a review and a comment. It really helps the show continue to keep growing. You can subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where paid subscribers this week can get access to some brand new reporting about why election experts and officials say the plan to physically interfere with the midterms coming from the White House is doomed. Probably. But that doesn't mean they're not worried. What are they worried about? Well, you'll have to subscribe to find out. All right, let's get on with the show. This week, the House passed the Save America Act, or the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, which is now headed for the Senate. We'll talk about what's happening there at the very end of this episode. The House is also considering the Make Elections Great Again, or MEGA Act. Both would be massive changes to what happens when you go to register to vote, cast your vote, and what happens to your vote and its information and the information about you later. The Save America Act would force anyone registering to vote to show proof that they're a citizen when they go register. I know it sounds reasonable, right? Except for a few things. The law says that proof of citizenship needs to be Real ID compliant. You know, that thing that TSA has been warning us about for 20 years, and some people still aren't with the program yet. Well, despite the fact that the law says a birth certificate, naturalization, adoption documents, or a military ID would all work, they actually don't, because none of those things are Real ID compliant, meaning only an actual Real ID or your passport will work. Now, that's a problem, because for starters, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 137 million Real IDs have been issued, which is less than half of all the IDs currently out in the U.S. right now. On top of that, 21.3 million people don't have ready access to their citizenship documents because they're at college or not living in the house where their documents are, or they're being held in a safety deposit box in a bank somewhere. About another 4 million people don't have access to their citizenship documents at all because they were lost or stolen or damaged in, say, a house fire or a flood. It would also affect millions of mostly women who get married and change their names or divorced and change their names so their original citizenship documents don't match their IDs. And when you look at passport holders, 51% of Americans have a passport right now. Ironically, for Republicans, the majority of passport holders are also Democrats, but keep that in mind for later. The other problem with the idea of being forced to prove your citizenship when you register to vote is It's already a law, and it has been since 1993. So this is just putting a hat on a hat. So, like I said, a solution in search of a problem. And if I start sounding a little bit animated in all of this today, it's because I have spent more than a decade debunking these exact same ideas every single election. And while I am happy to continue to do it, I am also exhausted. Let's move on to the MEGA Act. Now, that would require you to show your ID when you go to vote, which would mean another layer of preventing someone access to vote, because just because you're registered doesn't mean an overzealous, let's say, volunteer at your polling place wouldn't deny your vote because they don't believe that your proof of citizenship is actually real when you go to vote. Now, the MEGA Act would do all of those things I talked about in the SAVE Act, plus ending universal mail-in voting and gutting what's known as the motor voter law, which requires states to verify your eligibility when you go to renew your driver's license or apply for public assistance. Instead, the MEGA Act would put the burden of proving your eligibility to vote on you instead of on the state. The MEGA Act would also force states to almost constantly update their voter rolls to quote-unquote prevent fraud instead of the annual or semi-annual cleanup that states already do. And that would be a huge burden on states and election officials while not providing any more money to do those things. And it also comes with the likelihood of accidentally purging people who should be on those rolls. Election law experts also agree that all of these things in both the Save America Act and the MEGA Act would likely stop millions of people from voting because people don't have the right papers. They can't get the time off to or aren't physically able to get a state office to prove that they're eligible to vote. And we know that happens because in 2011, when Kansas passed a law just like these, it was struck down as unconstitutional after just 7 years, where a researcher cited by the judge said it is not impossible to reject the hypothesis that the rate of non-citizen registration in the state of Kansas is different from zero. Or to put that in like a non-academic syntax, what they're saying is non-citizens don't register to vote. What did happen, though, was 31,000 people who would have otherwise been eligible to vote in Kansas were denied that right as Americans. Now imagine that on a national scale. So why do this then if it means stripping Americans of the right to vote? Well, it's because Republicans say non-citizen voter fraud is out of control. And they say it's what Democrats want so they can rig elections. Here's Minnesota Republican Congressman Tom Emmer saying just that.
Their argument is absurd because it's a lie. Quite simple. This isn't about race or gender for them. This is about wanting to make sure that illegal aliens can vote for Democrats in future elections.
Surprise, surprise, that's not true. There's never been any evidence that Democrats are shipping in or encouraging undocumented immigrants to vote, let alone vote for them. For starters, if we take the administration's numbers of undocumented immigrants, which Trump and others keep saying is about an impossible 25 million people, and let's say half of them are voting age, and that Democrats are running a nationwide fraud scheme, including in deep red states like Texas and Florida, which have the second and third highest populations of undocumented immigrants, Democrats still lost the House, the Senate, and the White House in 2024. If they were rigging elections, why would they have allowed themselves to lose? But that little detour into logic aside here, according to numbers from the ACLU that are based on a Freedom of Information request from U.S. Immigration Services, as of 2025, just 0.04% of people who registered to vote were non-citizens. That's not people who voted. It's people who just registered to vote. And now, there are plenty of people who say even one person is too many, and sure, but often these aren't people who are nefariously trying to vote to undermine you. It's people who thought they were eligible, or most often are people who were recently made citizens, and they legally registered to vote with their new American citizenship documents, but those records just hadn't hit the national system online yet. It is impossible as well to separate the idea that you just heard Representative Emmer say that non-citizens are voting in droves from the white nationalist conspiracy called Great Replacement Theory. It's the idea that millions of non-white immigrants are being trucked into the U.S. by liberals, or more frequently Jews, or both. You'll hear them called globalists, to replace white, God-fearing, true American voters. It is a conspiracy that is as old as the U.S., and it's been used as a scare tactic since the Irish and Italian were coming over in the late 1800s, when Germans came over in the early 1900s, when Southeast Asians came to the U.S., fleeing wars that we were involved in the 1960s and 70s, and when Eastern Europeans and Latin Americans fled communism in the 1990s and 2000s, and then, of course, in the last 20 years, when so many Latinos and Caribbean immigrants have been fleeing violence. This idea is what Elon Musk pushes and pushed to create Doge based on trying to track Social Security numbers that have been given to non-citizens. And if you're wondering how that happens, non-citizens, including in extremely narrow conditions, some undocumented immigrants do get Social Security numbers, which lets them and their employers pay taxes, though it doesn't always mean that they're eligible for other benefits, including Social Security. Anyway, the people who support the SAVE Act and the MEGA Act who don't want to dabble in racism will often say that voter fraud in general is out of control, especially when it comes to mail-in voting. Except it's not. According to the far-right Heritage Foundation, the people behind Project 2025, since 1982, there have been just 1,620 proven claims of voter fraud. In just presidential elections since 1984, so I'm giving them back 4 years here and ignoring every state election and midterm election, the number of total votes comes out to around 1.3 billion. As a percentage, 1,620 votes out of 1.3 billion is 12 millionths of a percent. 12 millionths. Nowhere near any level of fraud that could have swayed any election, even if you add them all up and put them into one national election. The same goes for mail-in voting. The left-leaning Brookings Institute, using the far-right Heritage Foundation's tracker, found that mail-in voting fraud accounts for just 4 votes out of 10 million across decades. So, not an issue there either. And just like non-citizen voting, most of the time, people who commit voting fraud or mail-in voting fraud aren't criminals looking to steal an election. They're people who accidentally vote in person, forgetting they mailed their ballot early, or they send in a mail-in ballot for their kid who's at college, or they vote for their recently dead spouse or relative, or forgot to unregister an estate that they had just moved out of. So if voter fraud of any kind isn't a problem, again, the question is worth asking, why push for these bills? Well, it's because the people who end up losing their ability to vote tend to vote for Democrats. They are overwhelmingly non-white, women, the poor, and students. All are groups Republicans have historically had trouble getting to vote for them. And ironically, despite saying they don't like mail-in voting, 1 in 5 Republicans in this last election and 7 out of 10 people ages 50 and up who most of the time vote for Republicans voted by mail. And remember I said hang on to that idea of needing a passport to vote? Well, that would likely also disenfranchise more GOP voters because only 48% of Republicans have passports compared to 57% of Democrats. Now, voter ID laws are popular, and they kind of make sense, right? You often hear talking points like, you need an ID to drive, to buy beer, to fly in a plane, to apply for a job or government assistance. In fact, the White House just put on a fun little set of photos on Instagram last night saying those exact things. But none of those are constitutional rights. And even if they were, it doesn't get around the fact that voter fraud is infinitesimally small, no matter what individual cases or accusations you might hear about. What those tiny numbers actually tell us is our elections are extremely safe and extremely secure. Our states are very good at making sure the people who have registered to vote are who they say they are, and they are who they say they are when they go to vote. States do that in all sorts of ways, from signature verification, which has its own problems to be sure, to proof of ID at registration, which is required by federal law, to verbal and legally binding affidavits at the polls, to state-mandated audits and reviews of processes and procedures to keep states honest. And it is by no means a perfect system. I will be the first to tell you that. There are always irregularities and imbalances that states and counties have to go back and correct. It's called curing, and that never looks great. But again, if there were major problems with that system, we would know. So what these two bills actually do is put the burden of voting on us, on the Americans who have a constitutional right to have our voices heard. Instead, if Republicans were actually worried about the election integrity problem, which isn't a problem, but if they were really worried about it, they could put the burden on this state to make it easier for us to exercise our rights. That means putting more money towards modernizing state voter roll systems, improving access to federal databases and communication between agencies and states, while preventing private data from being leaked. They could support things like automatic registration at certain government offices and funding improved cybersecurity, which the Trump administration ended last year, leaving states to scramble to secure themselves before this election. All of those things could be done safely and securely without preventing people who should be able to vote from voting. And there are things that we've known have worked for decades. It's not like we're on the edge of tech here. It's just that's not the goal of these bills. So let's end with what happens next. Well, the MEGA Act hasn't made it out of the House yet, so put a pin in that. The Save America Act, though, did pass the House this week and is on its way to the Senate. It would need 60 votes to pass, and that is just not going to happen. Republicans, that means, have been talking about ending the rule about the filibuster, preventing Democrats from holding up the vote, and returning to a much older rule called the talking filibuster, which is complicated, but neither of those things matter because the Republican Majority Leader of the Senate, John Thune, said he's not interested in blowing up those rules, and there aren't the votes to do it anyway. But that doesn't mean that parts of these bills couldn't be added to a compromise bill to say, keep the government open like we're going to need tomorrow, or some other more watered-down version of the bill that still requires something like voter ID. Those are things that we'll have to wait and see on. But the important thing here is that anytime you hear people talking about voter ID, they're not talking about keeping your vote safe. They're talking about taking voting away from specific people. All right. That is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcast. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack to get access to that brand new piece of reporting this week about why the threat to elections is probably overblown. Probably. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.